Some of the biggest spring decor trends this year might surprise you, and their prices might shock you. So today, I'm sharing these trends and showing you how to use inexpensive thrift store finds and simple crafting supplies to recreate the look. So you can get that high-end spring style for a shockingly low price. One of the biggest spring trends this year is garden-inspired decor. Think mossy greens, botanicals, and pieces that look like they came from a greenhouse. To recreate this look, I thrifted a wood and metal angel for just $1.99. It has a star theme, so I removed the metal star from the angel's arm and then repainted the skirt with ivory-colored chalk paint to conceal the blue stars. At first, I wasn't planning on removing the wings or metal embellishments, but I decided I wanted to repaint the body. So I carefully pried them off and unscrewed the arms. I realized the body was connected to the skirt with a dowel rod, so I slid the body up and painted it with a garden-inspired mossy green chalk paint. Next, I cut out a design from IOD's Lost Garden rub-on transfers. I love these viney floral designs. I centered it on the front and wrapped the edges around the sides. There was a little bird perch near the bottom of the skirt, so I cut a small slit in the transfer so it would lie flat. Then I just took my time rubbing the transfer on and slowly peeling it back. The edges were a little tricky, but if you go slow, you really can get a perfect transfer. Since one side had a lot of empty space, I cut out an additional flower to add to that spot. Then I reattached the arms and wings, and I was ready to start adding some garden-inspired embellishments. I found a tiny wicker basket in my stash and filled it with small flowers I cut from Dollar Tree greenery. To attach the basket to the angel, I threaded a piece of florist wire through the hole in her arm and then twisted it around the basket handle to secure it in place. To disguise the star cutout in the skirt and add a little extra embellishment, I used more of that Dollar Tree greenery, pushing a few leaves right through the opening. Then, to further hide the hole, I hot glued a miniature bird nest over that spot. I could still see just a little bit of the star peeking through, so I finished it off by hot gluing a bit of moss over those spots. I also had a miniature birdhouse in my stash that I wanted to use, but I did need to re-drill the hole in the angel's arm so it would fit. And instead of reattaching the metal hearts to her body, I just glued small flowers over the little nails that were left behind. Although the little hairsprings were adorable, they just felt a bit too industrial for a garden angel. Luckily, they pulled right out, and in their place, I made a small ring of greenery and flowers to place on her head. I added some moss in the center to cover the holes and glued a small bird on top. I also glued some moss in the crack between the body and skirt and then pushed a couple stems of faux greenery into the moss. The second spring trend I want to share is woven and rustic textures. Think baskets and natural fibers and materials. Items that are easy to find at the thrift store. I wanted to create a picture frame with a little texture, so I started with this basic black frame that I thrifted for $1.99. To brighten it up and make it feel more spring-like, I popped out the glass and then gave it 2 coats of an off-white chalk paint. Once it was dry, I lightly distressed it with a sanding block. But if you don't like the distressed look, you could easily skip this step. To add texture, I'm simply going to hot glue this small grapevine wreath to the frame. I actually thrifted a bag of 6 of these for just $3.99. I actually thought it looked cute just like this, but you guys know it's hard for me to leave anything plain. So I cut up some of that faux greenery from the big basket I was pulling from in last week's video. I trimmed it into smaller stems and tucked it into the grapevine wreath, adding a little hot glue here and there to hold everything in place. I had previously printed out this Audubon image and didn't end up using it, so I cut it down to fit in this smaller frame. All Audubon images are in the public domain and free to download at audubon.org. To highlight the soft pastel flowers in the print, I added a pink bow to the wreath. Another big spring trend is mineral or earthy green. You see this color everywhere in nature, things like moss, eucalyptus, and sea glass. For over a month, I saw this dusty, ivy-covered topiary sitting on a shelf at Goodwill. And when it was still there this week, I decided I had to rescue it. First, I removed all of the ivy, which was really dating it. Since the grapevine ball was firmly attached to the pedestal bowl, I decided not to remove it, which would likely have caused a lot of damage. Instead, I did my best to remove all of the old moss from inside the ball and around the rim of the bowl. Then, to add a second level to the topiary, I grabbed a dowel rod and stained it a darker brown with antiquing wax. Then I inserted it through the grapevine and into the styrofoam in the bowl. For the top level, I wanted to use a fuzzy green rabbit from Dollar Tree, which is actually just made from styrofoam, so it was easy to push it onto the dowel rod. I wasn't loving the look of the dowel rod, so to make it look more rustic, I wrapped it with a couple strands of raffia. Then I brushed antiquing wax over the raffia. To further disguise it, I wrapped some moss-covered wire around it. This wire is so handy. I'll have it linked for you in the description. Next, I hot glued some moss over the ball in spots where the grapevine was broken or split. At first, I wasn't sure how I was going to cover the styrofoam on the inside, but I decided to just squeeze a bunch of clear glue through the grapevine ball until the styrofoam was fully covered. Then I pushed loose moss to the inside and pushed the moss into the glue using an old paintbrush. To recover the outside rim, I hot glued small moss clumps over what remained of the old moss. Although it was looking much better, I thought the topiary still needed something more. So I grabbed a faux plant from that big thrifted basket. It ended up being the perfect size, and I thought it added a lot of interest. But I wanted to dress it up even more. So I placed a few bird eggs inside the grapevine ball and used the wires on the bottom of a faux bird to attach it to the side. The pedestal bowl was a weird orange color, coppery almost, instead of terracotta. So to soften it, I brushed Waverly's white wax over it and then used a cloth to wipe most of it off. Now it looks more like an aged concrete planter. For a finishing touch, I took a Dollar Tree transparent butterfly sticker, trimmed off the excess transparency along the edges, and hot glued it to the rabbit's nose. Grandma or grand millennial flowers are making a big comeback this spring. Think delicate roses, sweet lilacs, and the vintage style blooms we grew up seeing in our grandmother's homes. I love the pretty floral design on the front of this thrift store pillow, but the pillow itself was looking a little sad, and it had yellow fabric on the back, which goes with nothing in my house. So I decided to use it to upholster a small stool that I thrifted some time ago. First, I cut a piece of foam to fit the top of the stool. Then I added 2 layers of batting that were just a little larger than the foam. I stacked everything up with the pillow cover on top. Then I flipped the whole thing over so that I could staple the fabric around the underside of the stool. I made sure the floral design was centered on the top of the stool. Then I added just 1 staple in the center of each side so I could double check that nothing had shifted and the flowers were still centered. Once that looked good, I went back and finished stapling, pulling the fabric taut and making little pleats as I worked my way around the curved ends. There was a little bit of the red design from the front of the pillow showing at the 2 ends. So to cover that up and give the stool a more finished look, I hot glued some green braided trim along the bottom edge. Then I used a little upholstery cleaner and a rag just to freshen up the fabric. This turned out even cuter than I expected. The next spring trend I want to talk about is curved and organic shapes. From rounded frames and furniture to sculptural accents, this is a fun one to recreate with thrifted finds. I thrifted this oval mirror for just $2.99. It has a nice solid wood frame, but it's pretty plain and boring. So let's take it apart and give it a little personality. I had this floral tablecloth in my stash that I thrifted years ago, and I chose to use it because grandma or grand millennial florals, like those seen on chintz fabric, are actually super popular right now. I placed the mirror face down on the fabric and cut out most of the center. Then I made deep slits all the way around the remaining fabric. Next, I worked in small sections, spraying adhesive on the back of the frame and then pulling each piece of fabric taut before pressing it into place. Once I had gone all the way around the inside of the frame, I repeated the process along the outside of the frame, first cutting away most of the excess fabric and then cutting deep slits into the remaining fabric to create flaps that I could easily fold over and adhere in place with spray adhesive. Then I was ready to put the mirror and wood backing back in place. I just made sure everything was lined up properly so the screws would go right back in where they belonged. Unfortunately, when I flipped the mirror over, I noticed a few spots where the wood frame was peeking through from the slits I had cut. So I decided the easiest fix was to hot glue some trim along the inside of the mirror. I would have loved to have used black braided trim, but I didn't have any, so I went with red rickrack instead. And honestly, I think it turned out pretty cute. Just when I thought I was done, I remembered this green dragonfly bottle stopper that I thrifted for $1.99 a few months ago. I thought I would have to cut the dragonfly off, but surprisingly, it was just screwed onto the bottle stopper. The best adhesive for attaching metal to fabric is probably E6000, which is what I used. The next trend is biophilic design, which is all about bringing the outdoors in through the use of plants and earthy materials. If you're like me and struggle to keep real plants alive, faux plants are more realistic and popular than ever. For a unique plant pot, I thrifted this vintage pedestal bowl. To begin, I wanted to create a large moss ball, so I glued half of a styrofoam ball onto another piece of flat styrofoam to make it a little taller. Then I wanted to create some roots that would look like they were growing out of the moss ball. So I pulled a few strands of jute from a heavy piece of twine and hot glued them between the two pieces of styrofoam. Then I glued the bottom piece of styrofoam to the bowl and glued the two pieces of styrofoam together. Next, I covered the ball using small clumps of moss, making sure that the jute strands were still visible. For my plant, I cut up a few inexpensive fern stems that I just recently bought at IKEA, and I tried to evenly spread them around the moss. I think the key to a good arrangement is cutting the bunch into individual stems of only 1 or 2 leaves. Then to make it look more realistic, I created a few of those curly-stemmed fiddleheads. I just wrapped the end of a piece of the moss-covered wire around a paintbrush a few times and then pushed the opposite end into the styrofoam ball. My ferns also usually have some bare stems where the fronds have died and fallen off. So I added a few tiny branches from my yard and a little Spanish moss to emulate these dead stems. Another spring trend I'm loving is metals with patina, those aged, weathered finishes that add instant character and are often found in vintage gardens. I thrifted this tea kettle that was probably hand-painted in the 1990s. This is another item that had been sitting on the Goodwill shelves for several weeks that I decided to rescue. I wanted to repaint it, but first I sanded over the design to remove the texture of the original paint. Then I gave it 1 coat of Dixie Belle's bronze paint. Once the paint was fully dry, I brushed on a second coat of the paint. And while the paint was still wet, I sprayed it with Dixie Belle's patina. I used both the green and the blue spray to create a rusty and verdigris finish. Dixie Belle products are a little pricey, but these paints are amazing and they do last a long time. Not only are aged metals popular right now, but aged clay containers are trending too. It's all about earthy tones and time-worn textures that we can easily replicate using simple thrift store finds and DIY techniques. For this project, I thrifted this tall metal pitcher for $4.99. I first painted it with terracotta colored acrylic paint, but my camera clicked off during this part. Once that coat was dry, I used a sponge to dab on a second coat of the terracotta paint and a little light brown paint. While that was drying, I went ahead and mixed up some gardening lime with a small amount of water. You can find gardening lime next to plant fertilizers at most garden centers. I brushed this muddy, gritty mixture over the entire pitcher, but you might want to leave some areas uncovered depending on the look you're going for. Once the lime was dry, I sanded over it to remove most of those small little pellets that remained. To seal the surface, I brushed a coat of matte Mod Podge over the entire pitcher, and then I left it to dry. Since the handle still looked more like metal than clay, I decided to wrap it in twine, but I wasn't loving that look, so I pulled it off and rewrapped it with raffia instead. The gardening lime on its own just wasn't giving me the aged look that I was hoping for. So I grabbed some moss and mixed it up with a little water and white glue. And then I began rubbing this messy mixture over the pitcher, focusing mostly on the top and bottom edges. This would obviously have adhered much better had I not already sealed the pitcher. But you live and learn, and I still like the way that it turned out. I hope you enjoyed today's video and will let me know, what decor trends are you loving this spring? And if you're looking for even more thrift flip inspiration, here's another video I think you'll like. Thanks so much for watching today. Hope to see you next week.